Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who doesn't want me to install anything on my property. After growing up in an apartment complex and moving between rental units for most of my adult life, I always wanted my own home. I thought I had found paradise when I saved enough to buy a small house in a quiet neighborhood. Unlike postcard suburbs, our street had ranch-style homes, newer builds, and older properties that had seen better days. What I loved most was that each house had a personality shaped by its residents. The lawns were varied in size and lined with shrubs and gardens. Some homes had small gates, some were completely sidewalk accessible. A diverse mix felt authentic to me. I wanted to stay there. My property wasn't big or impressive. I loved the single-story house with 2 bedrooms, an attic I could turn into a studio, and a small backyard from the moment I saw it. A large oak tree shaded the area, and when the wind blew, the leaves rustled, creating a relaxing afternoon soundtrack. I imagined hosting barbecues, planting a vegetable garden, and possibly adopting a dog that could run freely without bolting into the street. I wanted to build a sturdy wooden fence around the perimeter. It seemed normal, especially since I wanted more privacy and security. I remember talking about the fence with my friend Darian, a part-time handyman and carpenter. Seeing my tight budget, he offered to help me with labor. We spent one evening reviewing designs, local building codes, and permit requirements. I need a permit if the fence is taller than 6 feet, and there are rules about how close it can be to the sidewalk or neighboring properties. Darian and I designed a 5-foot fence with front and back gates. We checked every rule to comply with local laws. At that point, I thought everything would be easy. I never intended to trouble unknown neighbors. After closing on the house, I noticed a woman across the street staring at me every time I went outside. She always swayed in a squeaky chair on her front porch. Her constant expression ranged from mild irritation to deep resentment. I waved politely and she sometimes nodded but rarely spoke. At first I thought she was reserved, maybe nervous about a new neighbor. However, her demeanor suggested more than shyness. I discovered her name was Kimura. Other neighbors casually mentioned that she had lived there for a while, that she liked to keep the neighborhood looking uniform, and that she was the first to mention overgrown lawns or excessive porch decorations. Kimura was known for meddling in everyone's business to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics. People here were used to her unsolicited comments. Many neighbors said they found her overbearing but tolerated her nagging because it rarely got serious. I hoped she would get used to me and we could coexist with patience. After meeting the neighbors, I figured her interest in uniformity might not matter much. I thought everyone was friendly. Darian and I bought fence materials at the hardware store a week later. We returned to my house and marked the yard with stakes and string, measuring carefully to avoid encroaching on others' property. I wanted to build the fence slightly away from the edge so I could plant a flower bed inside to brighten the perimeter. We spent most of the day digging holes, placing posts, pouring cement, and leveling. I felt proud and thrilled. I had never owned a property or built a fence. This felt like a real home improvement. Late afternoon, I felt a prickly sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was staring at me. Kimura was standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, inspecting our work for violations. She moved forward and cleared her throat. After dropping my shovel, I walked over and smiled at her. "Hello?" I said. "We're just starting, but it's going well." Without greeting me, she said, "None of the other houses on this street have a fence like this, you know." Her calm voice hinted at warning. "Many keep it open to maintain a neighborly feel. Perhaps you should reconsider." I politely explained that I wanted privacy and had researched local codes to ensure everything would be done by the book. She stared at me longer, pursed her lips, and left. Darian raised his eyebrows, and I shrugged. We had a permit, and I wasn't infringing on anyone's property. I ignored her cold reception and worked. 2 days later, the fence framework was half up. Darian and I had installed the posts around the front yard, leaving room for a gate, and were moving to the sides. After word spread that I was building a fence, most neighbors seemed indifferent or mildly curious. Some, like Lillian next door, liked that someone was bringing new ideas to the neighborhood. Kimura's annoyance was public. She told everyone my fence would damage the look of the street and lower property values. The surrounding blocks' houses were all different, making it strange. Some had tall wooden fences, others had chain-link dog fences, and some had large hedges. But not on my street. Why she thought my project was an unprecedented eyesore was beyond me. That night, after Darian left, I ran a quick errand. Kimura was pacing near my front yard boundary, occasionally looking at the half-finished fence as I backed out of my driveway. Now that I think about it, I should have noticed her agitation was growing. I returned to find her gone and everything normal. The posts were undamaged. I was relieved she hadn't tried. My phone rang the next morning. Winston, another neighbor, lived a few houses down. He warned me that Kimura had been talking non-stop about calling the police if I didn't stop construction. She was telling people my fence would ruin her chances of selling her house soon. Winston advised me to monitor my yard because Kimura could do anything if she was that riled up. I thanked him and hung up, feeling dreadful. A police cruiser pulled up in front of my house an hour later as I was nailing the first panel of wood to the posts. Walking over, I wiped my forehead as two officers exited. Although polite, they had that official stance, hands on their belts, scanning the situation like they'd seen it before. "Is there a problem, officers?" I requested. One said, "We got a call from a resident who claims you're constructing something illegally and may be encroaching on her property. May we look?" I said they could inspect the fence. I even showed them the property stakes Darian and I had carefully laid out in the yard. They also saw my building permit, which stated that a 6-foot fence was allowed on my lot. They checked everything, measured it, and thanked me for cooperating. Kimura came from across the street with a thin smile that looked plastered on, like she expected the officers to shut down my operation. She listed my fence as an eyesore, said it would destroy her property's marketability, and said the neighborhood was outraged. Professionally, the officers asked her if she had evidence of my illegal activity. She stumbled, then said no neighbors wanted this fence. The officers calmly told her that my permit was valid. I was not in violation of city or county regulations, and they could not stop me. She was stunned, as if she thought calling the police would make me remove the fence immediately. Kimura thanked the officers coldly, turned around, and marched home after an awkward silence. Officers apologized for interrupting and left. As the cruiser drove away, my heart raced, not from fear of them, but from realizing Kimura was taking her disapproval campaign to new heights. Over the next few days, I focused on fence finishing. Due to work, Darian couldn't help much, so I did most of it. The physical labor was exhausting, but unusually therapeutic. I felt proud after installing each panel. That feeling of being watched persisted throughout. Every time I looked over my shoulder, Kimura was glaring from her porch or pacing the sidewalk, looking for a flaw. I saw her take phone photos twice. She may have been gathering evidence, but I couldn't see how it would help since I was legal. I chatted with my neighbor Lillian one afternoon. She told me Kimura was rumored to sell her house and move in with her daughter in another state. She spent a lot on interior upgrades like new kitchen cabinets and light fixtures. Lillian also said Kimura was borderline obsessed with cleaning the neighborhood to increase her home's value. "I think it's less about the fence and more about her illusions of controlling the environment," Lillian sympathized. "She's always been like this, but since moving, she's more intense." The insight was helpful, but it didn't justify her hostility toward me. Despite my frustration with Kimura's interference, I tried to be polite. I worked hard to clean up the construction site. I removed scrap materials daily to avoid street-level lumber and trash piles. I even planted some bright chrysanthemums along the fence to add color. I tried, but Kimura's frowns deepened. She told someone on the phone that my fence was ghastly and that she worried potential buyers would be turned off. I thought it was an irrational fear because many nearby houses had fences of all kinds. However, logic wouldn't calm her panic over her property's value. Just when I thought we'd reached the limit of tension, the situation escalated again. One morning, I went outside to continue working, only to find that someone had yanked down a section of the fencing near the rear corner of my lot. 3 panels had been pulled loose and they lay crumpled on the ground, nails bent and wood splintered. I was furious and heartbroken. I had spent money and energy building this fence, and someone's deliberate act of vandalism was both insulting and costly. I couldn't prove who had done it, but Kimura was my prime suspect. I took pictures of the damage, then went to talk to Winston next door and Lillian across the street to see if either of them had witnessed anything. Winston was out the night before, so he hadn't seen it happen. Lillian said she heard strange noises around midnight, but thought it was probably raccoons rummaging in someone's garbage. Neither could confirm that Kimura was responsible, and I didn't have any security cameras installed yet to catch the culprit on film. So I had little recourse but to file a police report about the vandalism and hope they might keep an eye on the area. Upset as I was, I refused to let that act of destruction stop me. I bought replacement panels and reinstalled them, this time reinforcing them with extra brackets and screws. I also decided to install motion sensor lights along the fence and a small security camera that pointed toward the backyard. If anyone tried that stunt again, I intended to catch them on camera and have actual evidence. After a couple more days, I finally completed the entire fence, minus the finishing touches like stain and sealant. It felt good to walk around my yard knowing I had clear boundaries, a sense of privacy, and some measure of security. Within a week, Kimura put up a for sale sign in her yard. She began hosting open house events on weekends, leading groups of potential buyers around her property while giving them a spiel about the neighborhood. I couldn't help but notice she seemed to gesture toward my house occasionally, no doubt spinning some dramatic tale about how my fence might be a drawback. I overheard bits and pieces of her conversations, phrases like, "It used to be so open and friendly here, and I'm sure you could speak with the owners about removing it," which was ridiculous since it was fully within my rights to have that fence. Whenever she caught me looking, she'd quickly avert her eyes as if she wasn't openly bashing my property to her prospective buyers. It was all so petty and aggravating, but I tried to maintain my composure. I thought that perhaps once her house sold, Kimura would leave and the drama would end, but she discovered another angle to torment me. One Saturday morning, I found a notice taped to my front door from the local code enforcement office. It said there had been a complaint that my fence was allegedly too close to the sidewalk, potentially violating setback requirements. This was nonsense because I had measured meticulously and I knew I was within the permissible range. Still, the complaint forced me to schedule a visit from a city inspector to verify compliance. When the inspector arrived, I provided him with all my documents, including the permit, the property survey, and the measurements. He was a friendly, straightforward man who had probably handled dozens of disputes like this one. He measured everything himself and confirmed that the fence was indeed in compliance with city regulations. After finishing up, he admitted that he'd encountered a number of frivolous complaints recently. Though he never mentioned Kimura by name, he assured me that as far as the city was concerned, I had done everything properly and had nothing to worry about. He even gave me a letter stating that my fence passed inspection. That same day, feeling more emboldened now that my fence was officially certified, I decided to speak with Kimura directly. Maybe if I showed her the letter, she'd realize she was fighting a losing battle. I walked across the street, caught her in her front yard where she was doing some minor landscaping, and greeted her in a calm tone. I handed her a copy of the inspector's letter, explaining it confirmed my fence was in compliance and that I was hoping we could just move on peacefully. She barely glanced at it before saying, "I don't care about your paperwork. It's still going to hurt my property's value. You have no consideration for this neighborhood's traditions." She flung the letter onto the ground. "I'm hosting another open house this weekend, and I don't need you scaring away potential buyers. You've done enough damage already." Trying to maintain a civil tone, I said, "I'm not trying to scare anyone, Kimura. I'm just living my life. I have a right to build a fence, and the city has confirmed it. If you keep making false claims, I'll have to consider my own legal options." She laughed, a sharp, derisive sound that made my stomach twist. "Sure, take legal action against me because I'm looking out for the neighborhood. Do what you want." I left, feeling angrier than I had in a long time. When I got back to my porch, I noticed Lillian hovering by the fence line between our properties, clearly having overheard the confrontation. She gave me a sympathetic smile and said, "She's going to keep pushing. You might want to get a camera for the front yard too, just in case." My mind raced with the possibilities of what Kimura might do next. I decided Lillian's advice was sound, so I promptly bought an additional camera and installed it at the front corner of my house. Over the following week, I continued to mind my own business. The fence was complete after all. I started focusing on the interior of my home, repainting a guest bedroom, and rearranging furniture. Whenever I passed by a window facing the street, I would glance out to see if Kimura was up to anything suspicious. Most times I caught her staring at my fence from her porch, but she seemed more sullen than confrontational. I hoped, maybe naively, that she was finally resigned to the fact that I was not taking down my fence. Then came the second police visit. This one was completely out of left field. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when I was home alone, taking a break from painting. I got a call from the local station saying that there had been a complaint of harassment filed against me. I was stunned. They asked me to come down and provide a statement. Confused and worried, I drove to the station, where an officer told me that Kimura claimed I was making threatening gestures toward her open house visitors, and that I had been harassing her. According to the complaint, I was deliberately letting my dogs bark incessantly at her guests, among other odd accusations. The problem with that story was that I didn't even own a dog. I had been thinking about adopting one, but so far, I hadn't. As for menacing gestures, the only thing I might have done was wave hello to a few people that I saw touring her house from across the street. Hardly a crime. I calmly explained to the officer that I didn't own a dog, provided my own side of the story, and mentioned that I had installed security cameras around my property. I offered to share any footage that might prove I hadn't done any of the things Kimura accused me of. The officer listened sympathetically, then said something about how they often deal with petty neighbor disputes like this. He informed me that unless Kimura provided proof of my supposed harassment, there wasn't much they could do. I was relieved not to be in any real trouble, but outraged that Kimura would stoop to such blatant lies in an attempt to bully me. After that incident, I decided enough was enough. I was tired of living in fear of what Kimura might do next, and I was especially fed up with the time and stress her false accusations were costing me. I spoke with a local attorney who gave me some advice on sending a cease and desist letter regarding her harassment. The lawyer explained that while this wasn't necessarily a lawsuit, it could serve as an official warning that if she continued to make false claims or damage my property, we would take legal action. I also asked the attorney about what to do if I caught Kimura trespassing or vandalizing my fence again, and she mentioned that I could file for a restraining order if the behavior continued. I drafted the letter with the attorney's help and had it sent to Kimura via certified mail, so I'd have proof she received it. The letter explicitly warned her to stop making fraudulent claims to the authorities, to code enforcement, or to potential buyers regarding my property. It also stated that any further acts of vandalism or defamation could lead to legal proceedings against her. Frankly, I hated feeling like I had to escalate the matter, but I felt cornered. She was the one repeatedly calling the police and accusing me of all sorts of nonsense. For a brief period after she received the letter, things were quiet. She stopped glaring at me whenever I passed by, and I didn't see any more random complaints filed against me. I went about my life, finishing some landscaping in the backyard, setting up a small vegetable garden behind the fence. The motion sensor cameras remained in place, both front and back, quietly recording everything, just in case. The calm didn't last. One evening, I heard a commotion outside. When I checked my front yard, I noticed that someone had moved some of my potted plants and scraped the side of the newly installed gate, leaving behind a shallow gouge in the wood. It was minor damage, but enough to draw my attention. I went to check the footage from the front yard camera. Sure enough, I saw Kimura sneaking across the street, creeping along my sidewalk, and then deliberately kicking my potted plants before scraping the gate with what looked like a metal object. I couldn't believe the nerve. This time, I had incontrovertible proof of her vandalism. The next morning, I marched into the local police station with a flash drive containing the footage and filed a complaint for property damage and trespassing. When the police paid a visit to Kimura that afternoon, she evidently tried to deny everything, until they mentioned that I had video evidence. It turned out that her open house attempts had been floundering. She was getting offers, but none were high enough for her liking. My guess was that her frustration boiled over, and she decided to vent it by damaging my property yet again. This time, however, she couldn't just walk away unscathed. The police warned her that further acts of vandalism or harassment could lead to an arrest, and they made sure to document the complaint thoroughly. Even if the fine was small or just a misdemeanor-level offense, it was at least something that let her know there were consequences to her actions. After the police left, I walked outside and was promptly greeted by several neighbors who had gathered. They wanted to know if everything was okay. Winston patted me on the back, saying, "I saw the officers at Kimura's place. Good for you for finally standing up to her." Lillian nodded, adding that Kimura had made plenty of enemies with her overbearing attitude and constant meddling. Despite the emotional and financial toll it had taken on me, it was somewhat reassuring to see that nearly everyone else was in my corner. I realized that I was not alone in dealing with her. In the following weeks, Kimura's house did eventually sell, but for a price significantly lower than she'd initially advertised. I learned this from Winston, who was friendly with the real estate agent representing Kimura's property. Whether the fence factored into it or not, I can't be certain. The real estate agent apparently mentioned that the market conditions weren't as favorable as Kimura had hoped, and that she'd set her asking price too high to begin with. Whatever the reason, Kimura was forced to accept an offer that didn't meet her lofty expectations. I confess to feeling a tiny flicker of satisfaction at the news, considering everything she had put me through. It felt like a mild form of poetic justice. After all her claims that I was ruining her property value, the main factor in her lower sale price turned out to be her own unrealistic demands. Right before Kimura moved out, I had one last encounter with her. She was loading a cardboard box into her car trunk when I stepped out to retrieve my mail. Our eyes met, and for a moment, there was a charged silence. She actually walked across the street, still on the sidewalk, mind you, and said, "You should know you've made a lot of enemies here." She said it in a quiet, almost trembling voice. I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "I don't think that's true, Kimura. I've spoken to our neighbors. They all seem quite supportive. Some of them told me they're relieved you're leaving." My tone was measured but firm. I was done being intimidated by her. She looked at me with a mixture of resentment and sorrow. "You might feel like you've won, but you'll see how lonely it gets when you wall yourself off. A fence can keep you locked in too." With that cryptic remark, she turned, walked back to her car, and drove away. I stood there for a long moment, letting her words roll around in my mind. Part of me wanted to laugh off her parting shot as pure bitterness. Another part recognized that she might genuinely believe her stance, that open yards make for open relationships. But in my experience, it's the people, not the yard designs, that build or break a sense of community. The fence was never about shutting people out. It was about feeling safe and establishing clear boundaries. Life after Kimura left turned out to be a breath of fresh air. The new owners of her house turned out to be a friendly young couple who put up a small picket fence of their own in the front yard to contain their toddler. They didn't seem to mind my taller fence one bit, and in fact, they complimented me on the workmanship. They joked that Kimura's old listing must have overlooked how neighbors having fences isn't exactly a crisis. Over time, we grew quite friendly and even exchanged tips on gardening and home repairs. It was the kind of neighborly vibe I had hoped for when I moved in. As I added finishing touches to my property, like painting my newly sealed fence a warm cedar hue and installing a small bench under the oak tree in my backyard, I reflected on everything that had happened. The entire ordeal with Kimura taught me an unexpected lesson about assertiveness. In the past, I'd tended to back down or avoid conflict, especially with someone so openly confrontational. But this time, I stood my ground, made sure I knew my legal rights, and took the necessary steps to protect myself. It wasn't fun to deal with the police complaints, or to pay an attorney to draft a cease and desist letter, or to worry that my property might be vandalized again. But I refused to let someone else's negativity and unfounded fears dictate how I lived in my own home. Once Kimura was gone, the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt lighter. Winston jokingly said I should become the block consultant for anyone who wants to build a fence in the future. Lillian shared that she had considered putting up a small trellis fence for her rose bushes and had refrained for years because she was worried about Kimura's backlash. "Now I feel like I can do it without inviting a personal vendetta," she laughed. It warmed my heart to know that my stance had encouraged someone else to follow through on their own improvements. The sense of solidarity was something I never anticipated when I started this fence project. On top of that, the fiasco with Kimura actually brought me closer to several neighbors. We bonded over shared exasperation at her overreach, but we also discovered we had more in common than we realized. We began organizing monthly get-togethers, small potlucks where each household contributed a dish, standing around, sampling each other's cooking, and chatting about everything from community events to local politics. We forged the kind of neighborly ties that truly define a community. Ironically, it was building a fence, often seen as a barrier, that ultimately helped break down some social barriers in the long run. By the time autumn rolled in, my fence was fully stained and decorated with festive harvest wreaths I hung from a few hooks. I even got around to planting a row of sunflowers along the inside edge. Every time I stepped outside, I felt a surge of contentment. This was my home. I worked hard to make it comfortable and secure, and I had the right to enjoy it without interference. The fence stood as a testament to my perseverance and a reminder that boundaries, both literal and metaphorical, are sometimes necessary for peace of mind. A few months later, Kimura's property officially changed hands. The new neighbors settled in, and the entire block seemed to move forward. No more repeated police visits, no more ominous complaints to code enforcement, just the usual rhythms of suburban life: lawn mowers humming on Saturday mornings, kids riding bikes down the sidewalk, people walking their dogs in the late evening. One weekend, as I lounged in my backyard with a cold glass of iced tea, I recalled Kimura's final words about how a fence can lock you in. Looking around at the yard I took pride in, hearing the friendly hellos from neighbors passing by on the other side, and appreciating the privacy I had while still feeling connected, I concluded that her prophecy was off base. I wasn't isolated. If anything, I felt more integrated into the community than ever. No matter how bizarre or disheartening the entire ordeal was, I can't deny the crucial message it reinforced. Know your rights, stand up for them, and never let someone bully you into submission, especially on your own property. Kimura had tried to undermine my legitimate home improvement, but in the end, she had to deal with the consequences of her own extreme behavior. While part of me felt a little vindicated by her financial losses on the house sale, another part recognized that her downfall was mostly of her own making. She refused to adapt, to cooperate, or even to consider that other people might have valid perspectives. That stubbornness boxed her into a corner, and she ultimately paid the price. Even though the process was exhausting, I'm glad I built that fence. It gave me far more than privacy. It taught me how to handle conflict and stand up for what's right in a lawful, measured way, and it introduced me to a wonderful community of neighbors who, as it turned out, shared my desire for a friendly and respectful environment. I learned that a person's property is their own, and as long as they follow local laws and ordinances, no overzealous neighbor should be able to dictate what someone does with their home. When I walk out my front door now, I can't help but smile. The fence stands proud, a symbol of my homeownership and a boundary that respects my need for privacy while not infringing on anyone else's rights. My neighbors compliment it. I've gotten used to the routine of opening and closing the gate, and in a funny twist, some of them have started discussing improvements to their own yards, including the potential addition of fences. It's as though, in standing up to Kimura, I inadvertently gave them permission to make changes they'd been hesitant about for years. And now, when I picture Kimura's final glare, I don't feel anger anymore. If anything, I feel a bit of pity. She let her fear of change and her obsession with her property's marketability sour her relationships with the entire neighborhood. But life moves on, and the street is a friendlier place now. There's no more tension, no more daily stress about who might call the police over a harmless home improvement. I can host barbecues in my backyard, adopt a dog whenever I please, and do any lawful renovation without constantly looking over my shoulder. While I never asked for this battle, I'm proud of how I handled it. I respected the law, gathered evidence, and refused to be intimidated. In the end, Kimura faced the repercussions of her own actions, and I got to keep the peaceful home life I had longed for. So if there's a moral to this saga, it's that well-placed boundaries, both in the physical sense and in personal dealings, are sometimes the best way to live amicably, even if you have to face down a hostile neighbor or two in the process. Friends, thank you. See you soon.